The wind off the prairie carried dust and memory in equal measure. Sarah Brennan stood at the edge of Cedar Ridge Cemetery, her black dress catching the late afternoon light like a crow's wing against wheat. The gravestone before her was simple, carved from local limestone, already weathering at the edges. Captain James Brennan, 1842 to 1876. Beloved husband, 6 months. That's how long the earth had held him. 6 months since the telegram arrived, since the flag came folded, since the silence moved into her house and refused to leave. The town had been kind at first. Casseroles appeared on her porch. Neighbors tipped their hats. The preacher checked in weekly. But kindness, Sarah learned, had an expiration date. After 3 months, the visits stopped. After 4, the whispers started. She didn't notice at first. Grief has a way of making the world distant, like looking through water. But slowly she surfaced. The house was too quiet, the bed too wide, the future too long. Then came Thomas. He wasn't handsome in the way James had been. James had been all straight lines and military bearing, even in sleep. Thomas was softer, weathered, a carpenter whose hands knew wood better than words. He'd lost his own wife 2 years prior to consumption. They met at the general store, both reaching for the same bolt of black fabric. "I'm sorry," he'd said, pulling back. "Don't be," she'd replied. That was all, but it was enough. They began talking. Small things at first. The price of lumber, the early frost, how grief sits in your chest like a stone you can't cough up. He made her laugh once, just once, telling a story about a hammer and a very stubborn nail. The sound startled her. She'd forgotten what her own laughter sounded like. 3 months later, he asked her to marry him, not with flowers or poetry, just standing in her kitchen, hat in hand, looking at the floor. "I know it's soon," he said. "I know what people will say, but I'm tired of being alone, and I think you are too." She looked at him for a long time, at the sawdust still caught in his collar, at the calluses on his knuckles, at the way he waited without pushing. "Yes," she said. The town erupted. Mrs. Calhoun, who ran the boarding house, stopped speaking to her entirely. The banker's wife crossed the street to avoid passing her on the boardwalk. Even the general store clerk, who'd known Sarah since childhood, couldn't meet her eyes. But it was Sunday that broke everything open. Sarah and Thomas walked to church together. She wore the same black dress, but she'd removed the mourning veil. Thomas wore his best suit, brushed clean, his hat in his hand. They walked slowly, deliberately, like soldiers approaching a battlefield they knew they couldn't win, but had to fight anyway. The church steps were crowded, families clustered in tight groups, their conversations dying as Sarah and Thomas approached. The silence spread like ice across water. Sarah felt Thomas's hand touch the small of her back. Not possessive, steadying. They climbed the steps. The crowd parted, but barely. Sarah could feel their eyes like brands. She heard the whisper, low and meant to be heard. Shameful. Inside, the pews were full. Their usual spot, third row on the left, was occupied. Every spot was occupied. Sarah stood in the aisle, Thomas beside her, and understood. There was no room for them here. Preacher Davidson stood at the pulpit, watching. His face was unreadable. Then Thomas moved. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. He simply turned to face the congregation, his hand still resting lightly on Sarah's back, and spoke. "My wife lost her husband 6 months ago." His voice was steady, quiet, but it filled the church like smoke. "I lost mine 2 years ago. We both know what it is to sit in a house that echoes, to set one plate instead of two, to wake up reaching for someone who isn't there." The church was silent. Not the silence of respect, the silence of held breath. "Some of you think 6 months is too soon. Some of you think she should wear black for a year, 2 years, forever." He paused. "Her grief is hers, not yours to measure, not yours to judge." Mrs. Calhoun stood abruptly. "Captain Brennan died a hero. She dishonors his memory." Thomas turned to her slowly. "Captain Brennan told her, on his deathbed, to be happy. He wrote it in his last letter. I've read it. She showed me." His voice didn't rise, but something in it hardened. "I am making her happy. That is not betrayal. That is keeping a promise he couldn't keep himself. Sarah's breath caught. She hadn't expected him to say that, hadn't expected him to share that sacred thing. He loved her enough to let her go, Thomas continued. Do you love her enough to do the same? The silence that followed was different, uncertain. Preacher Davidson cleared his throat. There's room in the back pew, he said quietly. It wasn't an endorsement, but it wasn't condemnation either. Thomas took Sarah's hand. They walked together down the aisle, every eye on them, and sat in the last row. Sarah's hands were shaking. Thomas covered them with his own. The service began. Sarah didn't hear a word of it. She was too aware of the breathing around her, the shifting fabric, the weight of judgment that sat on her shoulders like a physical thing. Her mind kept replaying Thomas's words. Her grief is hers. No one had ever said that before. No one had ever stood between her and the world's expectations and said enough. She glanced sideways at him. His jaw was set, eyes forward, but his hand still rested near hers on the pew. Not touching, but close enough to feel the warmth. This man, who barely knew her 6 months ago, had just made enemies for her sake. But when they stood for the final hymn, something shifted. The woman beside her, old Mrs. Patterson, handed her a hymnal. Didn't say anything. Just handed it over and turned back to her own singing. It was small, but it was something. After the service, they walked out together. The crowd had softened slightly, not welcoming, but no longer a wall. Thomas helped her into the wagon he'd brought. Before he climbed up beside her, he turned back to the church steps. Thank you, he said simply. To everyone. To no one. They rode home in silence. Sarah's throat was too tight for words. When they reached the house, Thomas unhitched the horse, slow and methodical, giving her time. She went inside, stood in the kitchen, looked at the 2 plates on the table, the 2 chairs, the 2 lives trying to knit themselves into one. Thomas came in behind her, didn't speak, just stood there, hat in hand, waiting for her to break or mend or simply exist. He would have liked you, Sarah said finally. Her voice was rough. I would have liked him, Thomas replied. She turned to face him. They'll talk for months. Let them. It won't be easy. It already isn't. She smiled then, small and sad and real. Why did you do it? Stand up like that? Thomas set his hat on the table, looked at her with those steady carpenter's eyes. Because someone had to, and because you're worth defending. She crossed the space between them, rested her forehead against his chest, felt his arms come around her, careful and sure. Thank you, she whispered. Always, he said. Outside, the sun was setting over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of fire and ash. Inside, 2 people who had known loss learned what it meant to choose each other anyway. The town did talk. For weeks. For months. Some never forgave her. Mrs. Calhoun refused to acknowledge her existence for 3 years. The banker's wife crossed the street until the day she died. But others softened. Slowly, grudgingly. Mrs. Patterson invited them to Sunday supper. Preacher Davidson nodded to them in the street. The general store clerk started meeting Sarah's eyes again. And Thomas built. He built them a new porch, wider and stronger. Built shelves for her books. Built a bench in the yard where they could sit together in the evenings and watch the light fade. On Saturdays, he taught her to measure and cut wood. Her first project was a birdhouse. It leaned slightly to the left, but he hung it anyway. Perfect, he'd said and meant it. Sarah planted flowers. Yellow ones, James's favorite. Blue ones, Thomas's. They grew together, tangled and bright. Years passed. The town's memory proved shorter than its judgment. New scandals arrived. Sarah and Thomas became simply another married couple, weathered and steady, like fence posts that had survived enough storms to be trusted. Sarah never stopped visiting James's grave. Once a month, she walked to the cemetery with fresh flowers. Thomas never asked to come, never questioned, just made sure she had what she needed. And once a month, she visited the plot beside James's, the one where Thomas's first wife lay. She brought flowers there too, because grief, she had learned, was not a competition. It was a country they had both survived. One evening, 20 years after that Sunday in the church, Sarah stood between the 2 graves. Her hair was gray now, her hands spotted with age. Thomas waited by the wagon, patient as always. The evening light caught the headstones just right, making them glow like old amber. She placed yellow flowers on James's grave. "You were right," she whispered, "about being happy." She placed blue flowers on Catherine's grave. "Thank you for teaching him how to love." Then she walked back to Thomas, who took her hand without a word, and they rode home together through the fading light. His thumb traced small circles on her palm, a habit 20 years old. Some gestures she'd learned become their own language. The town had long since stopped talking. But Sarah remembered. She remembered the day Thomas stood in that church and defended her right to live, to love, to move forward without forgetting. She remembered what he'd said. Her grief is hers, not yours to judge. And she carried those words like a banner. For every woman who'd been told she mourned too little or too much. For every heart that had been measured by strangers and found wanting. In the end, the greatest rebellion was not in what she did. It was in choosing happiness when the world demanded she suffer. And that, Sarah thought, was worth every whisper, every turn back, every closed door. Because Thomas had been right. Grief belonged to her, and so did joy.